The night the lights finally died across Europe did not come with a single thunderclap or a cinematic plunge into darkness. It arrived by degrees, first a shudder in the grids of the Baltics, then a rolling brownout that crawled westward like frost over a windshield, snuffing out street lamps in Warsaw, pausing to tremble the neon of Prague. Recovering just long enough to lull Paris into a fragile calm before extinguishing the city of light in one ragged sigh. By then the world already understood that the old order was ash. No one could say they had not been warned. The war that cracked open the century had begun in the chill February of 2022 when Russian armor ground across the Ukrainian frontier and the maps on every cable network bled eastward shades of crimson. At first, Europe declared that the Kremlin's ambitions would stall in the mud. In Brussels, they quoted troop counts and GDP ratios as though statistics alone were fortifications. In Washington, President Joe Biden promised weapons and resolve, and for 3 long years drones arced like mechanical swallows over the wheat fields of the Donbass. Then came January of 2025, bright with inauguration bunting and the guilt vowels of a slogan resurrected from an earlier season of unrest. Donald J. Trump returned to the White House beneath sky-blue banners embroidered with eagles and the promise of peace through strength. On the West Terrace, he raised a hand and declared that America would be first in all matters, including the right to tire of distant wars. His running mate, Vice President J.D. Vance, stood beside him, eyes narrowed against the winter sun, a boyish grin giving way to the hard lines of ambition. Marco Rubio, newly sworn as Secretary of State, promised a diplomacy of steel, swift, transactional, unburdened by what he called the sentimental detours of globalism. It took 6 months for the weapons convoys to cease rumbling toward the Black Sea. The last Patriot battery crossed the Polish border under a sunset heavy as molten copper, bound homeward to applause in Ohio auto plants' newly awarded defense contracts. In a televised handshake staged at a neutral villa on the Danube, Trump looked straight into the cameras and claimed he had ended the most wasteful European conflict since Sarajevo. The Kremlin's emissaries smiled with feline patience, offering opaque trade concessions and a ceasefire that was, in retrospect, little more than a cigarette break for tank crews. Elon Musk live-streamed the moment to the stars via a constellation of low Earth satellites that still glittered like phantom pollen against the stratosphere. The feed lingered on his face long enough for 69 million viewers to glimpse a flicker of triumph, the man who sold futures in Martian colonies now applauding a bargain that mortgaged Earth. What followed was less a cascade than an erosion. First the Donbass folded, then Odessa. A year became a decade during which treaties were signed in ink that seemed to evaporate before the cameras cooled. Europe shrank behind its own arguments over gas pipelines and refugee quotas, and when the rubbled silence finally rolled all the way to the Pyrenees, the Union was little more than a flattened logo on outdated passports. By the time Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin celebrated his 100th birthday, mind encased in the serum steel skull of a Kremlin-forged cyborg whose optic sensors glowed imperial gold, Russian armored divisions lounged beneath the Eiffel Tower. Field kitchens simmered beside the broken fountains of Versailles. 3 localized nuclear detonations had sown glassy craters across rural Germany and the Low Countries, proof enough that even a limited flash of apocalypse could cow a superpower an ocean away. Congress passed sanctions, the president delivered stern rhetoric, and the world learned anew how far morality could stretch before it snapped. Yet history is capricious, it tends to plant its seeds of revolt in the most unpromising soil. On a wind-carved plateau above the river Segre in what had once been Catalonia lies the cracked shell of the Santa Lucia hydroelectric facility. Built in the optimistic surge of the 1950s, abandoned after the rapid privatizations of the 2030s, it had spent the occupation years as a nesting site for bats and, for rumors, stories of intact turbines, of sluice gates that merely slept, of a dormant heart waiting for a spark. Fernando Casals first saw the dam at dawn, the concrete battered but unbowed, its spillway arching like the vertebra of some ancient leviathan. He was 43, thin as a dry reed, an engineer by degree and a reluctant revolutionary by necessity. Before the collapse, he had drafted wind farm schematics for an energy startup funded by the European Green Bank. Now he traveled the dusty back roads on a rust-red bicycle, a worn canvas satchel clattering with multimeters and circuit diagrams salvaged from university archives before the occupiers converted them into officers' barracks. At his side walked Louisa Roig, a biologist whose research on pollinator corridors had once earned speaking slots at Davos. Since the invasion, she had traded keynote lectures for midnight hikes, mapping safe routes between villages that bartered heirloom seeds the way earlier generations had traded contraband books. Behind them trudged Arnau Pasquale, former documentary filmmaker, now archivist of silence, lugging a hand-cranked camera in hopes that someday truth would require footage. Last came 17-year-old Nur Abdulajiva, a refugee from Kharkiv whose family had vanished in the Second Siege. She carried slabs of cedar bark etched with coded messages for the resistance, the only medium that eluded the drone's infrared sweep. They reached the generator hall through a door half strangled by briars. Dust curled in the light of their lanterns, drifting across switch panels that still bore the enamel logos of a long-liquidated utility. Fernando wiped a gauge with his sleeve, watched the needle twitch ever so slightly, and felt a pressure like wings beating inside his chest. Power was not merely amperes and voltage, it was memory given motion. It was the promise that nightfall might again be optional. Word spread along the clandestine frequencies of battered shortwave radios. By the time the cherry blossoms shivered in the ruined orchards of Lida, a dozen volunteers had slipped past the governor's checkpoints with bundles of copper wire coiled beneath their coats. Some were old union electricians from shipyards in Tarragona, others were teenage hackers who wrote code on scavenged laptops powered by bicycle dynamos. All arrived at Santa Lucia speaking the lingua franca of desperation. They worked without floodlights, timing their sparks to the phases of the moon, singing the anthems of forgotten republics under their breath. Nur painted blackout curtains with a paste of charcoal and egg whites. Arnau filmed every wrench turn, every bead of sweat, though he would not admit where he hid the reels. Luisa planted saplings along the dry spillway, reasoning that each root driven into the cracked concrete was a declaration of tenure. Within the governor's palace in Barcelona, a former art museum draped now in banners of russet and black, rumor arrived that lights were blooming in the hills. The governor, a man whose surname patterned itself on Moscow syllables and whose rank depended on stable darkness, summoned his adjutant. He demanded patrols, weapon checks, a re-education broadcast reminding citizens that illumination was a controlled substance. Where light returned, questions flowered. Where questions flowered, regimes grew afraid. On a June midnight, with the Milky Way smoldering overhead, Fernando threw the final breaker. Turbines that had slept for 2 decades shuddered awake, coughing out water and ancient birds' nests. A low thrumming traveled the length of the dam, down into the waterlogged tunnels, up into the bones of every volunteer, until it rose as a tremor in their teeth. In the hamlet of Sant Esteve 6 kilometers downstream, a single porch bulb flickered, then steadied, casting a pale corona over stones scarred by artillery. An old woman named Merce, who had not seen electric light since the week her grandson was conscripted, touched her cheek as though it might melt. Across the cracked asphalt of the plaza, children who had grown up believing night was natural law stared in wordless awe at the insect orbit of moths around the solitary bulb. Hope, like any luminous thing, is visible from great distances. Satellite patrols saw the anomaly, so did the drones. The governor's intelligence bureau flagged the coordinates, convinced at first that the glow marked a NATO incursion. Orders hissed through encrypted channels: isolate, interrogate, extinguish. Fernando watched the ripple of their triumphs spread through the valley and understood that they now inhabited the thin, bright moment between miracle and reprisal. He had restored more than electricity, he had violated the choreography of fear. In the humming of the turbines he heard a countdown neither he nor anyone under the new flag could pause. And yet, for that single sunrise, when the blades mirrored pink dawn onto wet concrete and every volunteer's hair glowed like filaments, there existed a Europe in which resistance was not a rumor but a measurable wattage. Long before the first official convoy appeared on the valley road, signs of the coming storm crept in like mildew, quiet, pervasive, and sour-smelling. Goatherders reported that the night sky now bristled with additional constellations, small pulsing beads whose flight paths converged above the Santa Lucia basin. Luisa, crouched in a thicket to catalog moth species suddenly drawn by the reborn luminescence, noticed that the usual hush of after midnight was broken every few minutes by the bed undertone of rotors flitting somewhere far overhead. And Nur, returning from a courier run to Belver de Cerdanya, spotted new graffiti on a barn door, a crudely painted light bulb snapped in two by a crimson lightning bolt, the occupier's latest emblem for sedition through wattage. Fernando convened an emergency circle on the generator floor. The air smelled of warm copper and river mist, the turbine's steady throb punctuated every sentence like a metronome. Arnau unspooled the film he had shot the night of ignition, fingers trembling as though the images themselves were explosive. If they capture this, he whispered, they will play it on loop as evidence of sabotage. I should burn the reels. but Luisa shook her head. History needs artifacts. Even if we lose, someone someday will need proof that we tried. Artifacts don't matter to the dead, Nur muttered, sliding her cedar bark tablets into a hollowed niche behind a fuse box. Her Kharkiv accent sharpened whenever fear pressed hard against her ribs. If the governor's men arrive with flamethrowers, even the river will burn. Fernando let them argue until their voices spent themselves. Only then did he unroll an engineering schematic across a workbench. The paper bore the watermark of the Generalitat de Catalunya, an artifact from a polity that technically no longer existed. With the blunt end of a caliper, he traced 3 thin red lines radiating from the dam, one toward Sant Esteve, whose porch bulb still shone like a votive candle at dusk, one toward Alos de Balaguer, where the townsfolk had hauled a rusted hospital generator into the square, and one toward an unnamed cluster of farmsteads that sheltered deserters from the Occupation Auxiliary Corps. These feeders, he said, voice barely louder than the hum under their feet, are the reason we will be attacked. They are also the reason we must not go dark. If we shut down now, terror wins without firing a bullet. A silence settled, dense as sediment. Even the turbines seemed to hesitate, waiting to learn whether their newfound purpose justified the danger. Finally, Arnau spoke. Then we document everything. We broadcast before they can twist the narrative. His old instincts, the filmmaker's reflex to cast illumination, literal and moral, wherever darkness congregated, found their footing. But the occupiers own every satellite band. Luisa's brow furrowed. They scrub pirated transmissions within seconds. Let them try. Arnau's eyes flashed the once familiar zeal of pre-war press junkets. We'll jump frequencies, bounce signals through Musk's defunct Starlink shells, even piggyback on the governor's propaganda net. If they sever one tongue, a dozen more will speak. Fernando exhaled. Resolve thickened in his chest like quick-setting resin, but he sensed its brittleness, strong yet liable to shatter under sudden impact. Very well, he said. We defend the current and the story about the current. One without the other is useless. The governor's convoy appeared at dawn 4 days later, a sinuous column of APCs coated in reactive armor plates that glimmered gunmetal blue under the risen sun. Above them keened a pair of surveillance drones whose optics shimmered like dragonfly eyes. Local rumor christened these machines Sirin after the mythic Slavic bird singers who lured souls to ruin. Their real designation was Model C-12, cobbled together in Kaluga factories from Chinese rotors and Israeli guidance chips. At the dam, volunteers took up positions mapped during frantic midnight drills. Old Union electricians manned switch panels rigged to arc flash any intruder fool enough to pry open a breaker box. Teen coders hunched over Raspberry Pi boards spliced into the spillway's CCTV grid, ready to feed the invaders loops of empty corridors. Nur crouched beside a steel sluice chain, clutching a repurposed bolt cutter that dwarfed her slight frame. Fernando paced the catwalk above the turbine hall, coaxing himself into the absurd calm of engineers everywhere, the belief that things devised by human hands could be repaired faster than they broke. Yet when the governor's loudspeakers crackled across the valley, the voice was eerily cordial, a cultivated baritone practiced at ribbon cuttings and executions alike. Citizens operating the Santa Lucia facility, it announced in impeccable Iberian Spanish unmarred by Russian consonantal grit, you are in violation of Occupation Directive 12. Shutdown procedures must commence immediately. Non-compliance will be interpreted as an act of insurgency. The phrase shutdown procedures chilled Fernando more than any direct threat. It was the language of bureaucracies that murder by memo. He toggled the dam's PA and answered in Catalan, knowing translation lag would sow confusion among the ranks below. This plant predates your directives by nearly a century. Its water belongs to the Segre, its power to the people of these valleys. We will not go dark. A pause, thin as the blade of a boning knife. Then the occupiers opened fire, not indiscriminately but with clinical precision, shredding the dam's exterior sensors and pulverizing 3 newly planted saplings that had dared to flutter green against the concrete gray. Inside, concrete vibrated like a plucked cello string. Dust hissed from dislodged ceiling mortar. Volunteers flinched, some clutching crucifixes, others muttering surahs or snatches of anarchist poetry. Yet the turbines continued their clean rotational mantra, electricity sprinting along copper arteries toward the villages that had already grown accustomed to reading after sundown. Fernando realized the occupiers would not storm blindly. They intended to sever arteries first, starve the dam of relevance, then march through its hollowed shell. He hurried to the emergency generator control, where 3 oversized levers governed floodgate flow. If forced, they could drown the valley road beneath a torrent, buying escape time for the villagers but also erasing every bulb his team had reignited. It was the cruel arithmetic of resistance, the same switch that saved lives could extinguish hope. While he hesitated, Arnau whispered from the stairwell, camera cradled like a newborn. "They jammed our uplink. I'm running the footage raw on a closed loop, but once they breach, it's a snuff reel." "Then get out," Fernando said. "Hide the negatives in the forest latrine. If we fall, someone must carry the images. And leave my lens to record corpses?" "No." Arnau's refusal was quiet, unflinching. "The world loves martyrs only after they're buried. I prefer witnesses." The invaders' second salvo came as a cascade of tear gas canisters arcing over the parapet. One struck the bronze plaque commemorating the dam's original inauguration. The metal sang and split, releasing a vapor that smelled of chlorine and wilted dreams. Gas coiled through vent gratings, slicking lungs with chemical frost. Volunteers donned mismatched masks, surgical, industrial, even carnival half-faces left over from some forgotten festival, yet still eyes watered, throats scraped raw. Luisa, guiding a group of teen coders to the overflow tunnel, collapsed mid-stride. Nur dragged her behind a turbine cowling and administered a crude anticholinergic syringe, whispered Kharkiv lullabies until the older woman's breathing steadied. Overhead, an occupier drone strafed the catwalk, spraying anti-personnel flechettes that chimed like hail against steel railings. Sparks ricocheted, briefly illuminating Arnau's silhouette as he filmed through the caustic haze. When the drone wheeled for another pass, its flank dipped too close to a generator vent where heated air soared upward. The thermal surge confused its sensors for a fatal heartbeat. It spiraled into a buttress and detonated, showering translucent shards across the hall. One wedge lodged in Arnau's shoulder, pinning camera strapped to flesh. His gasp was a cinematic intake, raw, honest, reflexive. Yet he kept the viewfinder raised, blood sluicing down his elbow, lens fixed on the embattled volunteers. The documenter documented even his own wounding, a mise en abîme of anguish inside purpose. Outside, the governor's vanguard reached the service gate, 20 soldiers in exoskeletal braces that turned strides into loping arachnogades. Their helmets bristled with lidar whiskers, their rifles spat subsonic rounds that could shatter knee joints without exit wounds. But they had not factored the valley's topography. Arnau, ever the location scout, had installed wide-angle mirrors along a disused irrigation ditch, reflected sunlight ricocheted into the soldiers' visor optics, whiteout brilliance searing augmented reality overlays. 3 tumbled, convulsing beneath feedback screech, others ripped helmets free, thereby sacrificing comms. It bought the damned defenders mere seconds, but in counter-assault calculus, seconds are eternities. Fernando seized the moment. Racing along the gantry, he disabled the automated sluice interlocks and signaled 2 electricians to crank open spillway number 3, but only halfway. Water thundered out, not enough to flood the valley, yet sufficient to undercut the convoy's access road, liquefying its packed earth shoulder into a slurry that swallowed the lead APC up to its turret. Occupiers scrambled, cursing through rebreathers, firing flares that hissed impotent against wet stone. Hope sparked anew among the volunteers, not the soft glow of porch bulbs but a jagged, adrenaline-bright ecstasy. For 40 minutes the defenders held. Ammunition was scarce, yet every improvised trip lines rigged from buzzer wire, small transformer bombs that spat arcs across puddles, magnified their limited arsenal. Even the moths joined the fray, swirling in confused constellations around the invaders' LED targeting beams. A occluding line of sight long enough for Nur to drag Luisa to a safer alcove and for an elderly electrician named Onofre to jury-rig a capacitance dump that flash-fried 2 exosuits servo motors. But attrition is a cruel mathematician. The occupiers regrouped. They deployed microwave crowd control guns calibrated to cook retinas at 200 meters. Concrete steamed where invisible beams swept. Onofre's heart fibrillated under the onslaught. He dropped without a sound, pacemaker sparking like a moth in a bug zapper. Nur cried out, her grief a strangled animal noise, but Fernando roared for retreat, shoving volunteers toward the turbine culvert that tunneled beneath the riverbed to a pine grove half a kilometer north. Arnau remained on the catwalk, camera still running. His blood loss painted black halos at the edge of his vision, yet he pivoted lens toward each fleeing comrade, framing them not as deserters but as seeds propelled on the updraft of crisis. The hall behind them bloomed in arterial reds and industrial oranges captured at 24 frames per second, a palette of insurrection. It was then the occupiers executed their final gambit. A mortar tube barked from the ridge, its shell traced a lazy arc before blossoming above the spillway in a corolla of powdered aluminum and white phosphorus. The flashbang concussive tore through the dam's facade, peeled rebar like string cheese, and ruptured transformer oil reservoirs. Flames leapt, greedy as new tyrants, devouring the very heart they claimed must not beat. Fernando staggered as the turbine's perfect rhythm stuttered, blades buckling under thermal shock. A harmonic scream, metal on anguish, reverberated through every girder. In that shriek he heard not defeat but childbirth, the ugly, tearing arrival of something irrevocably alive. He dashed back to the control panel, fingers blistering on hot Bakelite knobs, and punched the manual override that dumped the last reserve current down all 3 feeder lines simultaneously. A surge raced along copper veins, a sacrificial benediction meant to keep distant bulbs burning an hour longer, maybe 2, enough for villagers to see tanks on the horizon and flee into the olive groves. Across the valley, porch lights flared as though in frantic applause, then guttered to embers. Yet for that hour the night was not owned by occupiers or by fear. It belonged to every child who had ever traced shadows on a wall and dreamed of covenant stars beyond. Smoke roiled from the dam by the time Fernando reached the culvert mouth. He stumbled into Luisa's arms. She pressed a gauze pad against a shrapnel cut just above his eyebrow. Nearby, Nur crouched beside Arnau, whose camera lay shattered but whose right hand still clutched the intact memory card ripped from its guts. His pulse was thready, breath raspy, yet his eyes, bright, fevered, unfocused, searched the smoky firmament as though already framing a sequence only he could see. "We held the light," he wheezed. "Long enough," Fernando replied, unsure whether it was truth or morphine talking. Behind them Santa Lucia snarled like a wounded leviathan, gears seizing, concrete sighing, water hissing against molten metal. And yet electric ghosts still skittered across the distant valley, a porch lamp flickering defiantly, a church steeple cross briefly lit as though some invisible hand had clicked a lighter in salute. Proof that power, once shared, cannot be entirely recalled. It lingers in circuits and in memory, a seditious ember. Fernando realized the story was no longer his. It belonged to every villager who had glimpsed their own faces illuminated after years of grayscale dusk. It belonged to Arnau's footage, to Nur's cedar tablets, to Luisa's saplings whose roots now drank water laced with transformer oil and stubborn hope. And somewhere in the governor's palace, a calculation was being revised: brutality versus belief, kilowatts versus conscience. The occupiers could drown dams and crush turbines, but they could not uninvent the possibility of light. In the smoldering dawn, Fernando whispered to the survivors gathered around him, "Electricity is the byproduct of difference, positive to negative, potential to resistance. So is revolution. What matters is the circuit we build between." Above them, sunlight breached the ridge, pale, diffuse, impartial. Another form of illumination beyond any directive's jurisdiction. Smoke from the shattered Santa Lucia Dam drifted for days, a gray pennant visible across half of what had once been Catalonia. The occupiers added its plume to their daily situation map and assured the governor that the electrical insurgency was extinguished. But the valley folk read those curling vapors differently. To them, the column looked like incense rising from a sacred brazier, the sky itself carrying news that somebody, somewhere, had dared to strike a match. It began with whispers in the Saturday market at Aloes de Balaguer, where farmers sold pumpkins grown in radioactive soil and customers carried Geiger counters the way older generations carried purses. A woman named Rosa, widow, beekeeper, owner of the valley's last functional shortwave set, leaned across a stall and told her neighbor, "Electricity is courage that travels." She said a young Kharkiv girl delivered that line while trading cedar bark tablets for honeycomb. Within an hour the phrase had hopped 5 conversations, changing only in accent. By nightfall it was chalked on bridge abutments and barn doors, each scrawl crowned with a tiny hand-drawn light bulb that glowed solely in the mind's eye. Days later, the valley learned the dam's defenders were alive. Fernando's band emerged from pine woods half-starved but intact, guided by Luisa's botanical sense. She could tell potable water from poisoned sludge by the tilt of a single thistle. They found provisional refuge in an abandoned ski lodge above La Vansa I Fornals, its windows shattered by artillery years earlier, its dining hall now carpeted in spruce needles. There they licked wounds, rationed powdered soup, and argued about next steps while a midsummer hailstorm drummed on the ruined roof like an eager audience demanding encore. Arnau should have died twice on the hike, first from septic shock when his flesh-torn shoulder blackened, and again when a search drone swept the tree-line with ultraviolet beams. Both times he survived by virtue of sheer stubborn cinematographic intent. He told himself a documentary without a director was just unexplained carnage, and he refused to let history default to mute bloodshed. At night he lay feverish in a bunk once meant for snowboard tourists, clutching the memory card that contained 81 minutes of raw footage from the dam's last stand. Often he jolted awake babbling edit notes, crosscut turbines with porch bulb reaction shots, symbolic resonance as though the darkness were a post-production intern. Nur, meanwhile, carved new code messages onto fresh cedar bark, routing instructions for runners, temperature-stable penicillin recipes, a one-sentence manifesto in 3 languages, light is a vote no tyrant can count. She cached these tablets inside hollow fence posts along goat trails. The occupiers later found some and circulated photographs online as evidence of eco-terrorist indoctrination. They neglected to notice that each tablet's grain pattern formed a rudimentary contour map, guiding refugees to secret foothill passes. 1. The spark in the archive. In the great ruined library of Lida, a place that smelled of mildew, burnt insulation, and obstinate memory, lived Joanna Surratt, former curator of Iberian film history. The occupiers had converted most of the building into a munitions depot, but Joanna inhabited a crawlspace between sagging stacks, cataloging what shells had not yet shattered. She fed a contraband gasoline generator long enough each night to digitize 1 reel of film before fumes forced her to stop. When Fernando's messengers reached her with a battered memory card, she welcomed them not with handshakes but with antiseptic wipes. Nitrate film dust is explosive, and Joanna never let caution lapse into carelessness. She threaded Arnau's footage through a cobbled-together projector whose bulb was an LED headlamp taped to a Fresnel lens. Images jittered against a soot-stained wall, Nur silhouetted against blue-white turbine sparks, Luisa's saplings shredded by shrapnel, Fernando yanking down a breaker like a medieval headsman dropping a portcullis. Joanna recognized what she saw, raw myth still dripping placenta. In her archivist's heart, the footage was a new Spanish Earth, a fresh battle of Chile, proof that rebellion remained legible. If images survive, repression has not finished the job. Transmitting the files required cunning. Official networks were surveilled, civilian bandwidth throttled to a trickle. But satellite shells still orbited Elon Musk's half-decommissioned Starlink nodes, insecure yet reachable if one knew the handshake protocols. Some years earlier, Ukrainian coders had leaked backdoors into those protocols as payback for Musk's perceived neutrality during armistice talks. Joanna found the code on an old GitLab mirror and typed commands while artillery thumped beyond the city walls. At 3:17 local time, the first packet burst upward, slipping through atmosphere into relay, skipping across antiquated mesh until it kissed down on a darknet server operated by student activists at the University of Montevideo, one of the last free academic enclaves. From there, fragments scattered to Toronto, Reykjavik, Taipei. By dawn, clips of the dam's defense appeared in encrypted group chats labeled #Lumina, then on pirate radio feeds, then, astonishingly, on a short segment of Good Morning Montevideo introduced as footage from the fall of darkness. The occupiers' sensors tried to smother the leak, but digital spores resist herbicide. By the time takedown notices crossed the Atlantic, mirrors had multiplied. A media scholar in Johannesburg overlaid subtitles, a retired lineman in Manila composed a folk song around the turbine screen. In a Brooklyn basement, a community college dropout synchronized the footage to archival clips of the 2003 blackout, captioning the mashup, "When power returns, so does possibility." The phrase trended for 12 glorious minutes on the only social network the occupation authority could not infiltrate, TikTok for the deaf, where videos carry no audio and thus bypass automated linguistic filters. The governor of Catalonia demanded answers. His intelligence chief blamed transhemispheric agitators funded by exiled oligarchs. The governor did not care who paid, he cared only that his promised quotas of agricultural exports now risked disruption. He ordered a demonstration of control, 3 villages would be stripped of their microgenerators and the inhabitants marched to re-education farms. Fear, he insisted, must travel faster than news. 2. Washington, D.C., the other twilight. Across the ocean, Washington endured a different species of dusk. Strain lines etched deeper into President Trump's face, even his stage makeup could not conceal how 78 winters weigh on mortal flesh. Yet behind the resolute desk he remained showman enough to summon thunderous certainty about issues he half understood. Vice President J.D. Vance took on most domestic duties. Secretary Rubio championed sanctions that bit little and barked loud. They called it principled restraint. The world nicknamed it strategic paralysis. On a sweltering July morning, Rubio's staff slid a briefing to the Oval Office. Unauthorized Catalan hydroelectric broadcast, possible ecological terror nexus. Underneath, a low-resolution still from Arnau's footage showed nurse sprinting across a gantry carrying bolt cutters, sparks blossoming behind her like a halo. The caption read, "Insurgents exploiting civilian infrastructure." Trump skimmed, lips pursed. He recognized electric drama when he saw it ratings potential. But his instinct warned that explicit intervention would chip the facade of non-entanglement. Instead, he called an impromptu press conference where, beneath portraits of Theodore Roosevelt and Andrew Jackson, he declared, "I always said Europe needed to stand on its own 2 feet. This is what standing looks like, messy business, but believe me, they'll be fine." Journalists asked about rumors the Kremlin planned a grand review of troops in Paris to commemorate the 5th anniversary of Europe's pacification. Trump waved them off. "A little parade never hurt anybody. Have you seen our 4th of July? Fantastic." Elon Musk, watching from a Tesla-branded habitat dome on the outskirts of Boca Chica, live tweeted a single emoji, a light bulb. Observers debated whether it signaled approval of Catalan resistance or a tease for a new battery product. Stock prices rose anyway. But inside the Pentagon, analysts quietly compiled satellite heat maps of Catalonia. Embedded within the pixels, they noticed new clusters of nighttime luminescence, dim, irregular, yet undeniably spreading from hamlet to hamlet like a contagion of glow. One colonel warned, "Populate a map with points of light and you're also drawing a target list." Sooner or later, someone decides to connect the dots with cruise missiles. Her report died in a subcommittee, smothered by politics and the comfortable tyranny of distance. 3. The Pilgrim Circuit. Back in the Pyrenean foothills, Fernando's group could not survive on inspiration alone. Turbines lay wrecked, their valley hideout offered no future but snowdrifts. Decision crystallized around a hand-drawn map spread across the ski lodge bar, coffee mugs marked outposts, hazelnuts marked checkpoints, and a broken ski pole served as the railroad spur threading east toward the Mediterranean. The plan was wild: steal the mobile grid unit, a portable thorium microreactor, rumored to power the governor's palace. It had arrived months earlier as part of a Kremlin infrastructure modernization package, a gleaming cylindrical cask small enough to fit on a flatbed, dense enough to light a city. If captured intact, it could energize a clandestine network 10 times the dam's reach. How to hijack a reactor guarded by exosuited sentries. Arnau proposed distraction by media spectacle. If they are busy chasing narrative, their flanks loosen. Joanna suggested uploading a deepfake of the governor confessing incompetence, timed to detonate on state broadcasts during the palace's weekly address. Nur volunteered for the physical heist. "I can move where adults draw attention." Luisa, pragmatic, pointed out no one in their band actually knew how to transport or reconfigure a thorium core. Then Ona Vasquez appeared, a name previously whispered only in smuggler circles. Ona had once been Spain's youngest nuclear engineering prodigy, headhunted by France's EDF before reactors became artillery bait. After invasion, she vanished into the Basque Mountains. Now she bicycled up the lodge driveway wearing a fluorescent yellow rain slicker, towing a custom trailer bristling with Geiger counters. She introduced herself with a grin and a terse resume. "I make atoms behave or misbehave, depending on who's asking." Ona studied Fernando's plan, frowning at hazelnut checkpoints. Finally, she said, "Stealing it is feasible. Starting it elsewhere, also feasible. But shielding transport is tricky. One wrong jolt and you'll cook everybody's bone marrow." Fernando responded with a sigh, equal parts relief and dread. "There is a special terror in discovering your dream is possible. Impossibility would have been simpler." He asked what Ona needed. A lead-lined ambulance, liquid helium dampers, and a parade. A parade. Any mass gathering within Barcelona's inner ring. Crowds confuse facial recog. Plus, marching bands drown Geiger clicks. It happened that a parade loomed on the occupiers' calendar. The Grand Review in Paris extended via holographic simulcast to major district capitals, including Barcelona. Marching bands would not materialize. Occupation culture favored drone orchestras, but civilian dancers were being conscripted for heritage representation. Ona reasoned that within the swirl of pageantry, a disguised convoy could slip the reactor into a municipal tunnel network built under Franco, still unmapped by Kremlin cartographers. The group broke into task forces, Arnau to craft the deepfake confession, Joanna to insert it into broadcast cues, Nur to scout parade logistics, Luisa to assemble a medicinal kit for potential radiation burns, Fernando and Ona to engineer the mechanical cradle. Every clock ticked with double tempo, their nerves wired to that invisible metronome that clicks inside any insurgent plan, hope's heartbeat chasing doom's echo. 4. Rehearsal for a memory. To forge the deepfake, Arnau needed pristine audio samples of the governor's voice. Secret police archives were inaccessible, but Radio Barcelona Libre, a clandestine station run from sewers beneath the vanished El Raval quarter, had hours of intercepted speeches. Its broadcaster, a one-eyed anarchist nicknamed Saffron, handed Arnau a hard drive in exchange for a single vow: make him say something he would never dare. Arnau and Joanna huddled over antiquated editing rigs salvaged from the library. They fed the samples into an AI voice model once designed for audiobook narration. The irony pleased them. Then they layered video, blending the governor's rehearsed smiles with micro-expressions of uncertainty captured during previous supply chain briefings. Joanna insisted the final cut include a precisely timed pupil dilation. Truth isn't in words, it's in the half-second reflex you can't rehearse. The resulting clip lasted 43 seconds. The governor faced camera, uniform immaculate, banner of victory behind him. He declared, "Incredible Catalan, our glorious stability is crumbling, comrades. For every bulb we smash, two ignite in hidden corners. Fear no longer obeys us." They debated whether the last sentence was too poetic for an autocrat. Nur argued tyrants slip into poetry when frightened. Proof, she said, came from her memories of Kharkiv under siege when Kremlin spokespeople quoted Pushkin between missile strikes. The line stayed. Meanwhile, Nur infiltrated the parade's rehearsal grounds, posing as a stagehand for the drone orchestra. Her shuttle passes were forged by Joanna using century-old letterpress blocks and newly invented seals carved from soap. Officialdom respects embossing regardless of origin. She counted troop factions, timed drone patrol intervals, and located the mobile grid flatbed, a sleek white module emblazoned with a stylized atom stamped red. Two soldiers smoked beside it, chatting about transfer orders to Normandy. Their posture spoke of boredom, not vigilance. Boredom is the first ally of thieves. Back at the lodge, Ona and Fernando dismantled a disused ski lift gondola, lining its interior with scavenged lead roofing tiles fastened by epoxy that reeked of almond and regret. They tested the cradle's shock absorbers on downhill runs, hurtling the gondola along remaining cable until vibrations blurred vision. If it survived Pyrenean gravity, city potholes would be trivial. Each trial run attracted curious valley children who mistakenly believed rebels were reviving tourism. Arnau filmed their laughter echoing among dead chalets, then whispered into his mic, "Children of the blackout practice joy the way others practice piano, endlessly, defiantly waiting for a recital that might never come." 5 Symphony in Fission Major. Parade day dawned under bronze skies, Sahara dust blown by freak jet stream patterns that climate scientists could no longer measure. Most satellites now served military optics. Barcelona's avenues filled with conscripts in regional costumes, their every ribbon color-coded to match districts on occupation maps. Drones hovered overhead blaring orchestral simulations when violins soared, bass thrummed from subwoofers grafted to armored personnel carriers. It was bombast set to waltz time, tyranny choreographed as civic ballet. The reactor flatbed rolled behind a contingent of folk dancers spinning under remote command cues, every twirl precisely timed so camera drones captured smiling faces, not the exhaustion in eyes. Nur, disguised in stagehand overalls, walked beside a generator cart holding a clipboard of fake power readings. One guard glanced at her ID once, yawned, and returned to scanning rooftops for snipers that did not exist. At 10:07 a.m., Joanna pinged the broadcast insertion point. A single packet darted through Musk's defunct node Starlink, 1728. At 10:08 a.m., every public holoscreen from Barcelona to Brussels glitched. Pixels shivered, then reassembled into the governor's counterfeit confession. The parade slowed as soldiers looked up, faces tilting like sunflowers to an unsettling sun. Ona seized that heartbeat of confusion. She signaled Fernando over encrypted comms routed through bicycle-powered routers hidden in sewer grates. Fernando, driving the disguised ski lift gondola retrofitted as an ambulance, Red Cross painted with lipstick, pulled alongside the flatbed under guise of emergency inspection. 2 volunteers posed as medics claiming radiation leakage from the thorium cask. The smoking soldiers recoiled, fear of unseen particles outranks obedience. While they argued into static-choked radios, Nur triggered a pre-programmed drone choreography loop. The sky filled with swirling holographic doves, a scheduled finale accidentally cued 15 minutes early. Under that papier-mâché miracle, the reactor slid via hydraulic rails from flatbed onto the gondola cradle with scarcely a scrape. Fernando slammed the ambulance doors, Ona engaged magnetic clamps. Then they drove, not careening, for haste invites suspicion, but at the bureaucratically precise speed of an authorized convoy, 40 kilometers per hour. Behind them, the parade dissolved. Some civilians applauded the governor's confession, unaware it was fake. Others dropped banners and sprinted to side streets, instinctively sensing tectonic plates shifting beneath propaganda. When occupation commanders realized the reactor was gone, they barked orders that tangled in their own comm-jamming haze, Joanna's parting gift. Panic travels slower than light but faster than hierarchy. Still, they pursued. 20 armored bikes accelerated down the diagonal, exosuit riders aiming stun lances meant to disable vehicle electronics. Ona countered by venting the gondola's cryogenic helium reserves through rear exhausts, super-chilled vapor condensed mid-air, enough to fog optic sensors. Bikes skidded, collided, dominoed into a percussion of metal and curses. Yet one rider remained upright, visor cracked but functional. He drew within 10 meters, raised his lance. Fernando braked hard, swerving into a construction zone. Rebar cages loomed like rusted rib cages. The ambulance scraped through, shedding side mirrors and ugly sparks. The exosuit, bulkier, clipped a protruding beam. Rider and lance cartwheeled into wet cement intended for luxury condos that would now harden around him, a modern Lot's wife petrified not by salt but by hubris. At the tunnel entrance beneath Montjuic, resistance couriers guided the ambulance down spiral ramps lit only by smuggled LEDs. Doors sealed behind, lead-line ventilation slugged stale air. When Ona powered down the reactor's containment field for transport mode, she muttered a Basque prayer normally reserved for childbirth. Iter datala eta jarai beti argia, may the light come and stay. 6. Afterglow. News of the theft raced even faster than the original dam footage. A reactor is currency in a world that measures sovereignty in megawatts. The Kremlin, blindsided, accused NATO saboteurs. NATO, defunct in all but stationary, shrugged. Washington offered condolences but urged measured responses. Elon Musk tweeted the lightbulb emoji again, this time followed by a winking face. Tesla stock oscillated like a seismograph. In Paris, cyborg Putin postponed his victory parade, citing unforeseen energy realignments. Rumor held that his synthetic optics sensors flickered each time mention of Catalonia arose, as though ghost voltage coursed through wires meant to mimic nerves. European collaborators whispered that the immortal president feared one thing above assassination: irrelevance. Empires tolerate insurgency, they cannot stomach being overshadowed by it. Deep beneath Montjuic, Ona coaxed first trickles of thorium power through salvaged converters. Old subway lines lit one section at a time, flick, blink, steadied. Trompe-l'oeil mosaics on station walls, unseen for a decade, gleamed like buried cathedrals. Fernando watched teenagers skate across polished platform tiles, their laughter ricocheting ahead of the fluorescent comeback. He realized they were rehearsing freedom the way singers rehearse breaths between verses. Yet every lumen drew predators. Occupier intelligence traced helium signatures, mapped sewer exits, deployed sniffer drones. The new grid's lifespan might be weeks, perhaps days. The group understood they were only renting dawn. But they also grasped the lesson of Santa Lucia. Even short-lived brilliance etches afterimages on retinas and on memory. Destroy the circuit and you still cannot unteach the idea that darkness is optional. Fernando drafted a manifesto to accompany the reactor's eventual relocation because nothing in this war stayed put. He wrote, "We are custodians of difference, engineers of the gap between what is and what might be. Electricity bridges that gap like a prayer of electrons. Every bridge invites crossing. So cross." Arnau, arm in sling, filmed the writing by candlelight, zooming on ink strokes as though they were fuse lines to dynamite. Later, he set up a makeshift studio in an abandoned ticket booth, interviewing first-time commuters of the resurrected metro. One elderly man declared, tears catching neon reflections on his cheeks, "I bought this pocket radio in 1984. Tonight I heard music on it again. If death comes tomorrow, it will find me with a song in my ear." NER coordinated courier routes extending reactor power to street clinics, printing presses, internet nodes. She etched new cedar tablets encoding load balancing instructions, a guerrilla syllabus in photosynthesis and amperage. For each tablet confiscated, 2 replicas sprouted elsewhere. Coders called it the Cedrus Protocol. Above ground, occupation patrols found light seeping through pavement cracks, illuminating manhole covers from below like backstage footlights. One lieutenant radioed HQ in panic, "The city is glowing from inside out." His superior scoffed, yet some part of him shivered because tyranny, like mold, thrives in damp dark. Introduce daylight and the spores retreat. From a ridge overlooking the city, Luisa stood beside saplings transplanted from Santa Lucia's charred spillway. They had survived shock, radiological residue, and a 4-day drag over mountains. Their leaves now unfurled under sodium glow staining the clouds. She touched a fragile stem, felt sap pulse. "I thought roots meant staying put," she told Fernando. "Turns out roots can migrate if the promise of light is strong enough." Fernando answered not with words but with the gentle click of a circuit breaker in his pocket, the same breaker he had pulled at the dam. He carried it like a relic, a reminder that switching on sometimes requires first daring to switch off the life you knew. Far below, Barcelona shimmered, the briefest, bravest aurora of reclaimed wattage. Whether it would last the month or the night mattered less than the message broadcast with every photon. Your shadow proves a light exists. The decision to snuff out Barcelona's clandestine grid did not originate in the governor's palace. It spawned in a vaulted situation chamber beneath the Louvre, once the world's most visited museum, now partitioned into a fortress of polished gunmetal corridors lit by cold LEDs that never flickered. There, Cyborg Putin conferred with his triumvirate of algorithmic generals, AI decision engines housed in sapphire-cooled racks, each trained on centuries of imperial suppression. They processed Barcelona's wattage bloom against live threat matrices and produced a single-line verdict in block Cyrillic. Ustranith s najmenším energorazchodem, neutralize with minimal energy expenditure. The algorithm chose Project Eclipse, a kinetic orbital warhead first engineered during the Second Sino-Russian Pact. A tungsten rod the length of a city bus, sleeved inside a d-orbital canister that could strike at Mach 10 and leave neither radiation nor salvageable infrastructure. One blow to Montjuic's approximate coordinates and the nascent reactor would be vaporized, tunnels collapsed, insurgent myth reduced to sky-kicked dust. Yet even autocracies sponsor dissent within their own ranks. A junior data strategist named Kirill Sazonov, reviewing Eclipse's collateral risk graph, noticed that the blast radius intersected with the Sagrada Familia, the Basilica Gaudi never lived to see finished, now a barracks church where conscripted soldiers knelt before icons repainted to resemble Saint Vladimir. Kirill was from Irkutsk, no lover of Catalan culture, but he loved data fidelity. He flagged an objection. Destroying a symbol of sanctioned orthodoxy could fracture morale. His supervisor erased the annotation. Algorithms do not appreciate footnotes. Eclipse remained greenlit, one aurora underground. In the tunnels, Ona's thorium reactor sang at 50% capacity, feeding a spiderweb of copper salvaged from gutted telephone exchanges. Neon flicker had surrendered to steady glow. Metro cars, hauled from sidings, now ferried passengers along a single resurrected loop. Children pressed their noses to soot-smudged windows, marveling at fluorescent advertisements repainted by graffiti artists. Where there is current, there is courage. Every stop doubled as infirmary, classroom, broadcast node. Fernando feared the optimism. Systems, he knew, fail at their most radiant peak. Entropy waits for applause. He rotated maintenance crews, trained teenagers to calibrate field coils, rehearsed evacuation drills that ended in nervous giggles because rehearsing disaster feels absurd when the world is suddenly bright. He alone heard the micro-whine in a misaligned bearing, evidence the makeshift dampers were slipping. Overstressed the rotor and the entire cradle could melt. While he tweaked torque settings, Arnau stitched rough-cut footage into a 30-minute documentary titled Lightfall Rising. His voiceover, raspy, shoulder wound still healing, narrated the dam's last stand, the tunnel's birth, the stolen reactor's heartbeat. He ended on a shot of a girl tying a ribbon of glow wire around a sapling as metro lights pulsed behind her. Over the image, he whispered, "We are what we illuminate." Joanna encoded the film in a dozen bitrate tiers, ready for smuggling through any bandwidth crack in the occupation's firewall. Nur expanded the Cedrus protocol, engraving cedar tablets with more than routing data. Now they carried short excerpts from Quran, from Lorca, from Orwell, all banned texts, each line a fuse. She dispatched teenage couriers on skateboards refurbished with repurposed magnet train bearings. They shot out of metro shafts, vanished into alleyways, re-emerged kilometers away at sewage outfalls. Drones chased, but radar lost them amid heat ghosts and tunnel vents. Luisa's saplings, nourished by drip lines fed with reactor-warmed condensate, unfurled waxy leaves under improvised grow lights. Their roots pushed into cracks between basalt and concrete, prying open seams laid by Franco's engineers. Life, she mused, is the most patient lever. Two echoes in Washington. Across the Atlantic, America busied itself with the approaching state's energy summit, a televised gala at which President Trump intended to unveil the greatest hydrogen initiative the world has ever seen. Vice President Vance handled congressional wrangling. Secretary Rubio fine-tuned a sanctions addendum aimed at illegal Russian mineral exports. And Elon Musk promised a Starlink relaunch that would blanket rural America in freedom bandwidth. Yet Barcelona's glow seeped into the news cycle. Low-res underground footage appeared on pirate feeds, blossomed into cable talk show B-roll. A Senate subcommittee demanded a briefing on Catalan radiological anomalies. The Pentagon colonel who had mapped the luminescence cluster now spoke to an auditorium of yawning lawmakers. Each point of unsanctioned light is a micro-referendum against occupation. Most senators flicked through donor emails, but one aide live-tweeted the phrase #RepublicOfLight. Within hours it trended just below celebrity divorce gossip. Trump summoned Rubio. They're stealing Russian nuclear toys. Any upside for us? Rubio suggested covert non-lethal assistance, mesh routers, biosensors, something to bleed Moscow without entangling Marines. Vance, pragmatic, worried about refugee flows should Barcelona become the next Fallujah. Musk, dialing in from Boca Chica, offered his orbital junkyard of dormant satellites. Give me power allocation, and I'll beam them unfiltered net until they overthrow somebody. Trump grinned, ratings gold. But bureaucracy lumbers. By the time the National Security Council drafted an interagency directive titled Operation Nightlight, Eclipse was already tumbling out of low orbit. 3. The Tungsten Comet. At 2:14 local time, Kirill Sazonov, disobeying protocol, launched an encrypted DM to an obsolete NATO address. Tungsten rod inbound Montjuic ETA 6 minutes. Save archives. The message ricocheted through dead relays, finally pinging a Spanish ham radio hobbyist in Teruel who thought it spam. He forwarded it anyway to a friend whose cousin once dated an engineer named Fernando. The cousin, nursing insomnia at the Metro's makeshift infirmary, handed the scrap of Morse to Nur. 6 minutes is eternity if you spend it screaming through tunnels. Nur sprinted along the eastbound track, lungs burning, scattering passengers, shouting "Alerta!" Volunteers slammed emergency breakers, plunging segments into darkness to shepherd crowds toward deeper galleries. Ona yanked coolant loops into maximum recirculation. No sense saving the core if the people it could serve were ash. Luisa hustled saplings onto wheeled pallets. Fernando raced to the control alcove, ready to dump the reactor's control rods, though doing so risked irreversible shutdown. In the cavernous interchange chamber they called La Cupula, Arnau set up his tripod, camera already rolling. Joanna grabbed his elbow. "Run! History won't rewrite itself," he answered, steadying the lens on the vaulted ceiling. She cursed, but stayed. An archivist refuses to abandon context. On the surface, Barcelona slept beneath yellowish haze. Then sky tore open, a silent gash white-hot, broadening into a lance aimed straight for Montjuic. For a split second, the city brightened as though noon had been detonated at midnight. Vans parked on quiet streets cast quadruple shadows. Pigeons erupted from ruined bell towers. The tungsten rod punched through atmosphere, through layers of sedimentary memory, through the rocky crown of the hill into the tunnel nexus. Pressure became plasma. Sound lagged behind, an artillery roll magnified to organ stop. Shockwaves hurled metro cars like toys, cracked basalt ribs, collapsed 60 meters of roof. Dust roared, air fled, lights died. Then, astonishingly, other lights flickered back. Emergency circuits, those Fernando had over-engineered, redundancies nested in redundancies, sensed voltage drop and swapped to battery arrays cannibalized from derelict Teslas. LED strips guttered but stayed. Underground, survivors awoke in bruised darkness lit by red glow strips and thought. The night tried again. We are still here. Fernando, pinned beneath conduit, realized the reactor cradle's shock absorbers had half-worked. The core remained intact, but ventilation was gone. Coolant temperature climbed. Ona crawled to him, face streaked with blood and graphite dust. We have maybe 20 minutes before thermal runaway. Arnau's camera lay on its side, lens cracked yet sensor blinking. He dragged himself toward it, fingers feeling for the record button, whispering, keep rolling, like a mantra that kept his heart from failing. Joanna knelt, took over the mic, calmly described the devastation around them as though giving a museum audio tour. For the circuit must flow. Heat shimmered. Air tasted of copper pennies and burnt almond. Fernando calculated options. Vent steam into caved ruptures and hope fissures led topside, or unplug control rods again to scram the core, sacrificing their power dream forever. Between catastrophe and erasure stood choice. Eardrums ringing, noticed saplings she'd helped while seconds earlier now lay under rubble, leaves sizzling in heat haze. She remembered Kharkiv's botanical conservatory, how glass melted yet a single acacia bonsai survived because war forgot to look inside the greenhouse. She shoved debris aside, freeing roots. You rooted us here, she muttered. I'll root for you. Luisa, coughing blood, handed Nur a cracked length of drip-line hose. Water them, she croaked, delirious. They'll drink grief. Nur instead tied hose to a ruptured chilled water manifold, redirecting precious coolant to the sapling's pallet wheels, cooling axles that might otherwise fuse. Plants can wait, she said, pushing the makeshift cart toward the reactor alcove. Ona saw the gesture, eyes widening. She snapped a hose clamp around the line, funneling coolant overflow across the cradle's hottest vent port. Steam burst, but temperature gauges dipped a crucial 10 degrees. Improvised arboriculture became engineering solution. Fernando laughed, a sharp bark that tasted like dust, then ordered every remaining volunteer to scavenge metal ducts, buckets of tunnel sludge, anything that could serve as heat sink. They formed a bucket brigade of entropy, shuttling sludge that hissed when poured onto radiant casings. In the half-light, splatters looked like calligraphy on nuclear parchment. Arnau captured silhouettes passing buckets hand to hand, smoke swirling into haloed rings. Later critics would call it the greatest single take in documentary history. Time warped, 20 minutes thinned into 15, stretched to 18. Displays stabilized in yellow, dipped to green. Ona collapsed, laughing like a scientist confronted with benevolent absurdity. Saved by mud and sap, gravity of relief birthed silence. Then distant cheers echoed down intact corridors, survivors realizing the world had not ended, only shifted axis. Someone began singing an ancient miner's chant, dark humor about lumps of coal and lungs of ash. Voices joined, syncopated against drip and crackle. Fernando checked structural integrity. The tunnel beyond La Cupula was totaled, but feeder lines east and north still carried current. He whispered, "The circuit holds." Tears carved streaks through grime. 5 broadcast beyond oblivion. They could not stay. Aftershocks, radiation inspectors, chemical warfare squads would come. But before abandoning the reactor, Fernando insisted on one act: transmit. Arnau's half-edited light fall rising, plus newly recorded footage formed a brutal epilogue. The strike, the bucket brigade, saplings steaming against reactor light. Joanna compressed the file, split it across 20 thumb drives. Musk, awakened at 3 a.m. by Starlink sensor anomalies, found his console commandeered by unfamiliar code, Joanna's repurposed handshake from their first upload. Instead of blocking, he watched. The stream, patchy and stuttering, framed soot-smeared faces under red emergency LEDs. A young woman watering leaves with coolant, a wounded cameraman insisting, "Keep rolling." Musk typed a root-level override that boosted their bandwidth tenfold, then tweeted a rocket emoji alongside the hashtag Catalan Core. Within 5 minutes, 9 million phones buzzed. In Kiev, refugees huddled in metro bunkers cheered, an empathy of tunnels. In Warsaw, illegal rooftop radio beams rebroadcast the file onto blank billboards, each frame flickering across rain-slick avenues. In Paris, where the victory parade had been postponed yet again, guerrilla hackers projected the footage onto the Arc de Triomphe stone. Soldiers ordered to erase it instead lowered rifles, some mouthing, "We are what we illuminate." Washington's Situation Room exploded with arguments. Rubio called Eclipse a war crime that backfired. Vance muttered about humanitarian corridors. Trump wondered aloud if licensing rights to the documentary could offset future NATO dues. The Pentagon colonel, uninvited, released her luminescence maps to press. Headline writers christened the spreading dots the radiant resistance. Cyborg Putin experienced a glitch. Optical sensors reset, voice modulation stuttered. Algorithms recalculated, discovering that each severed light only galvanized 10 more. Quant models projected untenable rebellion within 17 months unless occupation troop levels tripled. Impossible without collapsing Siberian logistics. The triumvirate of algorithmic generals flagged project complexity escalation. In simpler terms, empire overload. 6. Exodus into dawn. In Barcelona, Fernando's group loaded survivors, saplings, and what remained of the thorium core onto flatbed trolleys. Tracks west were destroyed. They aimed southeast toward disused maintenance shafts rumored to connect with coastal storm drains. Nights ahead would be spent in salt stink, in tunnels lit by car batteries, under skies scanning for more tungsten spears. But departure felt less like retreat, more like pollination. Before sealing La Cupula, Nur hammered a cedar tablet into a surviving support beam. She carved no code this time, only 4 words in Catalan, Ukrainian, Arabic, and English. Let there be light, still. Sap resin will preserve it for decades. Perhaps archaeologists, free of tyrants, will find it and smile. Ona throttled the reactor to transit mode, reduced output, safe for lugging but still sparking 1 halo lamp affixed to the lead-line gondola. It cast a pale beacon through dust, a moving star in a man-made Bethlehem. Arnau, camera batteries depleted, slung the unit like a relic. Next reel goes coastal, he said, half question, half promise. Joanna squeezed his hand. An archivist's job, she had learned, is to accompany the story until it writes its own sequel. Luisa wheeled the pallet of saplings. Leaves singed, roots thirsty, yet alive. She whispered species names like prayer, Populus nigravar, Betulifolia, Quercus ilex, Cedrus atlantica. Fernando pressed the breaker from Santa Lucia into the soil. Every tree needs a seed of memory, he said. They marched. Up on the shattered hilltop, the eclipse crater steamed, baptismal font for a new legend. Smoke mixed with dawn, and in that mingling the horizon birthed color not seen since the old grid died. A shy rose-gold blush that kissed broken rebar and stray bullet casings equally. Somewhere cheap radios crackled with rumors. Valencia just lit its port cranes. Toulouse subways humming again. Prague hackers hijacked a football stadium's floodlights to spell resist. Points of light, once dots, began connecting into constellations. No longer targets to be bombed, but stars charting navigation routes for runaway hope. When the marchers reached a ventilation shaft that opened toward the sea, Fernando turned for a last glimpse of Barcelona's ruined underbelly. Emergency LEDs still pulsed in wounded cadence. Red then dark then red. A subterranean Morse that spelled nothing conventional yet conveyed everything necessary. We survived the night. He exhaled, tasting iron and ozone and possibility. Then he switched off his headlamp, trusting the single halo bulb atop the gondola to guide them. It glowed steady, small, absurd against the magnitude of shadow, yet perfectly sufficient to convince 100 souls that forward existed. They stepped into dawn.